All right, we're going to take a deep dive here into the shadow DOM. I can only make that joke for a little while longer if deep indeed gets removed from web components. So we're going to dive a little bit more into shadow DOM and how it works, particularly in terms of content. All right, so just review here, because this is important. We have our document tree, right? We have our normal DOM. Then we go ahead and create a shadow host, or we select a shadow host. And then we create a shadow tree with create shadow root, and we can go ahead and do that. We got our shadow root, and we can go ahead and do that over and over again. We have our light DOM, our shadow DOM, and our shadow boundary right down the middle. And we know this protects us from CSS leaking between the shadow boundary, and so that gives us the encapsulation, the scoping that we've been looking for with CSS that we haven't had before. Now we're going to talk about shadow DOM projection. So with shadow DOM projection, what it means is that we can take a node from the light DOM and projecting it into the shadow DOM. This is that content element that we've been seeing so far. And the important piece here is that this node is still in the light DOM. We are just projecting it to be rendered in the place where the shadow DOM is. So it will look visually as if it's being rendered in the shadow DOM. It gets rendered positionally in the shadow DOM, but it's still part of the light DOM. And we'll see that when we actually inspect it. So how do we do this? I have div class equals shadow. This is my shadow host. Then I have a node to be projected. So this is just my node. We all know that when I normally go ahead and create shadow root, this is going to disappear. This will no longer be rendered. My paragraph node will no longer be rendered. However, this was purposeful. However, we can use our content insertion points to show where it is. So if we want to render it, we use content. So the content element is a new element with HTML to support this feature of web components. And what it allows us to do is that we can set the inner HTML of our shadow root to be content wherever we would like this content to go. In talking about this feature, content, I ran across this quote. It says, using shadow DOM to separate content from presentation. This idea that, here we have our content, the content that we want within our component, the content that we're passing in, but we're separating that from what's actually in our component, right? We're just saying this little placeholder. And so that idea of separating content from presentation sounded really familiar, right? That's one of those principles that we had of OOCSS, and that's one of the kind of the key principles we've talked about in terms of CSS patterns. And I thought that was interesting, that indeed that is something that a feature that we have with web components that confirms what we've been seeking for a long time with modular CSS patterns. All right, so we've seen content before. This is something new. Before, all the content that we had, any of those nodes, would automatically get rendered in our shadow tree. But what if we wanted to be more specific with that? What if we wanted to say, I only want to take all the paragraphs and show those here? That's what we can do with select. So select is going to take the immediate child nodes, direct child elements only, not any descendant selectors, and it's only going to project those in your shadow tree. And we'll play around with that more to see what that feels like. But that means you can have more than one content element, and you can project these content nodes in multiple places, or project these light DOM nodes into multiple places. And you can project parts of them into multiple places. All right, so you can't actually traverse the tree for projected nodes. So when you have projected nodes via the content element, you can't just now query selector through and get them all. However, we have a special function that allows us to do that, get distributed nodes. And that's going to allow us to get any of these nodes that have been projected. So we can select the content element from within our shadow DOM, and we can say get distributed nodes, and that will give us a node list. We can also get those insertion points themselves, the content insertion points, via element get destination insertion points. Again, these are probably things that you wouldn't use very frequently because you are crossing the shadow boundary when you're doing this. You're either going to the insertion points to those content nodes, or you're going to the projected elements from the light DOM. But they are ways that you can get at what's in the shadow DOM. We also have shadow insertion points. So this gets a little kind of Inception-like. It's hard to start thinking and reasoning about how this exactly works, because you end up with shadow insertion points for additional shadow trees. We're not actually going to go into that. It gets very complicated very quickly, and it's not particularly useful out of the box, so we won't go into too much there. All right, so that's content. We're going to spend some time adding content to some of our elements, and they're really important for our components, because without content, you're really just, all you have is an encapsulation wrapper. You don't actually have any API for, adding in new elements. And the way we expect HTML elements to work is that we can wrap things in them. And we continue wrapping things in them, all the way down the tree. And so web components don't stop that. We continue that same paradigm, which means that we can use the content insertion points to also insert other web components. So we can start to have web component and nested web component and nested web component, and they'll continue down the tree. And so that gives us the full power of HTML that we would expect. All right, I'm going to skip the shadow insertion points, but it's good to know that they exist, and there's some further reading in the resources section if you're interested. All right, events in the shadow DOM. Here's the key. Events are retargeted in the shadow DOM to look like they came from the host element rather than the internal elements to the shadow DOM. So if you have HTML DOM events, these are your standard everyday events, things like clicks, mouse over, change events from input fields. If these events are triggered from elements within the shadow DOM, they're going to be retargeted to the parent node, to the host element. Not the shadow root, to the host element. And so that means that if you have a particular event, from the outside looking in, it looks like your web component is just giving off that event. You don't need to know the internals of how that component works to be able to have to listen to that event. There's an exception, as there always is, and that's that there are some events that never cross the shadow boundary at all. Abort, error, select, change, load, reset, resize, scroll, select, start. This might change. There's some talk about getting rid of either getting rid of event retargeting or just making it completely consistent so that they all cross the boundary or they don't, which I think is probably a good approach. Having this kind of specific list means that if you did have those change events, you'd need to re-trigger them on the host element. So this is going to be a short section. I want to really spend some time coding here and adding this to some components and starting to build out some other components. We've left out the tabs component for now. I don't know if anyone ever got to that. No? Okay. So the tabs component is a little more complicated. We've seen it a few times now. I'd like to go ahead and try to build one, particularly because it's very useful now that we have content, and now that we have events, we can use the tabs component to trigger some events from there, and we can start to build out a useful component that has some functionality. Up until now, we really haven't had functionality in our components, so I think we should go ahead and do that. The shadow DOM is powerful, but it's also pretty complex. How many have had some trouble so far with, yeah, it's complicated. It's hard to reason about. And I think that's a fair criticism of the shadow DOM and web components. Maybe it'll get better as people get used to it, but it's definitely challenging to work with and understand how everything fits together. And it's really just a bit confusing, even for engineers who've been writing HTML, CSS, JavaScript for a long time. Understanding how exactly that boundary works can be tricky, especially in the world of the web. Yeah, and it's all going to change. Like a lot of the stuff we've talked about, this is all very much in flux right now, and it's been in flux for a long time. that being said, I think we're pretty close to a settled consensus on how the Shadow DOM would work and how a lot of the other features of web components will work. Shadow DOM is probably the trickiest thing and probably the one that will change the most, though. We'll talk this afternoon a little bit about that more. All right.
Before you close this video